Hey everybody, just in case you don't know who I am or what the hell you're looking at, my name is Kenyon Farrow, and just decided to do a couple of videos, maybe once a month or more, about books I'm reading. Because black people do read, black men do read, and I just want to share some things that I've been checking out. So for this month, I am reading this book, A Terrible Thing to Waste: Environmental Racism and Its Assault on the American Mind by Harriet A. Washington. Now, Harriet A. Washington is one of my favorite writers. She's, in fact, kind of the person I wish I was. She is a kind of medical journalist, and her first book, which a lot of you may be familiar with, was called Medical Apartheid. And the book kind of goes over the history of kind of biomedical research and kind of medical experimentation on black bodies in the United States. And it's a very well-known book. People now use medical apartheid as kind of a frame to talk about racism in, clinical research, healthcare, public health, etc. I will say that some of y'all, I don't think, read the book or read it to its full extent, because of the way I often see the book used as a way to sort of talk about a whole range of things about kind of racism in healthcare, biomedical research, or public health. But also, she's very clear in that book that she does believe that black people actually should participate in clinical trials, which is not the part that most people actually talk about. But in any case, her new book, A Terrible Thing to Waste, which came out actually a while ago, came out last summer, but I'm just getting to it, so now we're talking about it, is a book about kind of environmental racism and its impact on kind of intellectual and mental development in the United States, and the way in which racism and environmental racism, kind of impacts, kind of health and development, particularly focused on intellect and the mind. So the first chapter of the book starts with a history of the intelligence quotient, or the IQ, and how we came to the IQ kind of as a frame to understand a person's intellectual capacity to a certain extent. One of the things that she's very clear about in detailing that history is that the history was not in the development necessarily set up to kind of rank sort of groups, whether kind of racial hierarchies in terms of intelligence or intellectual capacity or class or gender or any of those things. Those things came a little bit later from the initial development of the IQ test. But she does, kind of critique the IQ for what it is, but also says that it was not developed for these other things that IQ has been used, in eugenics and in other kinds of racial white nationalist often projects, white supremacist projects that kind of rank, racial hierarchies with white people often on the top, sometimes Asians on the top, even some of the scholars who put this stuff out here, and then obviously with blacks almost always at the bottom, using the IQ as a particular frame. So that's how she sets up the book. Second part of the rest of the book is really a way to look at how the lack of regulation of toxins in the environment, everything from lead to chemicals that are in everyday household products, cleaning products, etc., things that are in furniture or other kinds of products that we buy that are totally unregulated by the Environmental Protection Agency, in a similar way that we have at least some regulations, although obviously not perfect, with food and drugs through the FDA, but we have far fewer regulations of how other kinds of environmental toxins make their way into products. And then obviously are kind of seep into the water supply, into food, etc. We've seen a lot in the last couple of years about Flint, Michigan, and kind of intentional lead poisoning of population of Flint. But we're also now seeing these same kind of stories about really heavy amounts of lead that are still in places like Baltimore, Newark, New Jersey, primarily black communities, through which the kind of removal of lead pipes and lead paint or whatever did not really transpire the way it was supposed to, roughly 50 years ago, when there was a big move to remove lead from paint and from pipes and other kinds of things. But in any case, so she talks about how all these kind of toxins, and goes through the research of how they actually impact intellectual and mental development, and have an association with things like violence and other sorts of social problems that are all sort of traced to the kinds of environmental racism of dumping these products, particularly in poor black and brown communities across the United States. Lastly, one of the things that I think this book is really important intervention, even though I don't think that Washington intends it to be this, but there's a lot of kind of stuff floating around in academic circles right now about kind of what you would call epigenetics. So this idea that you can look at various kinds of health disparities or problems in particular communities and trace the ways in which racism causes certain kinds of stressors in individuals that then actually changes their sort of genetic code and makes them more predisposed to particular kinds of conditions. And I'm not talking about sickle cell or anything like that. I'm talking about obesity or other kinds of heart issues or other sorts of things. And I think that one of the things that this book does is actually kind of puts a warning sign against some of those ideas, because one of the things that Washington is very clear about is that, first of all, DNA and genetics don't determine everything about humans. And so I think that she's really afraid of people using, in her case, in this book, sort of, IQ as a way to talk about the ways in which groups are sort of permanently, lack intellectual development or capacity. But her sort of position is that actually, really through heavy regulation and kind of just removing a lot of the chemicals and waste and dumps that exist, the cancer alleys in Louisiana and the places like that where environmental toxins are dumped, or here where I live in New York City in the South Bronx that has a huge asthma problem because of the highways that are built above, kind of crossing over the Bronx, causes these problems. So she's saying that we actually really need to do deregulation in a lot of ways, or regulation of these kinds of chemicals and active removing them from our air and materials and products that we use or whatever, as a way to abate some of these issues. But she's clear that these things are not intractable and aren't kind of become DNA embedded in such a way that I think a lot of people who are promoting this kind of idea support a weird kind of biological determinism that I think, frankly, as a black person, as a black gay man for that matter, have, lots of histories of people working to refute these kinds of ideas that are very much embedded in a lot of the kind of racial, white, supremacist, white nationalist kind of intellectual output that have also talked about sort of intractable problems in, black and brown communities that you can't get rid of because we are somehow genetically predisposed to violence and to abuse and to drug use or to child neglect or to a whole range of things, right? Or to obesity and all these other sorts of things. So I think Washington is actually, without directly challenging some of that stuff, I think she offers us some language to, I think critically about some of these problematic tendencies that I see circulating through the academy and some activist circles at this point. So I would say check this book out, A Terrible Thing to Waste, Environmental Racism and Its Assault on the American Mind, by the writer that I wish I was, Harriet A. Washington. Check this out. Next month I have a book selected already to talk about. It's a shorter book, so it won't take me as long to get through, and I'll come back to you. So if you're interested and want to talk about this book or whatever, please drop down in the comments, say something to me about what you're thinking, if you've read it, if you're thinking about reading it, or once you start reading it, just comment. We could have a conversation. All right, y'all. Peace.